Hey. Ooh, that was very loud. Can we start again? Hello. Thank you very much. It's the most difficult bit is stopping people once you've asked them to speak. So thank you. Any questions? How do we start? That was, so there were the things that I went through there, how to start. I think, we have a very good training called Transition Launch, which gives people everything they need in order to get started with this process. So I think maybe it's something for Norrie in terms of, if there's enough people who are interested to do that, to organise a launch training here. There are very good trainers who could come and do that. And that's really the best place to start, because it distills everything you need in order to really get started. And I imagine that one of the things that the Transition Luxembourg will do is to start to make some of those resources available. There's the French version of the last book has some useful resources in it about how to get started. The most important thing is to get started. Yeah. Very good question. Thank you.
Alors, excusez-moi. Je demande à Antoine de traduire M. Hopkins. Bon, Nicolas, merci d'avance. Je pose la question, comment les gens sont protégés socialement quand ils travaillent dans votre transition network ou dans
in the transition network, do they have any kind of social protection or healthcare system?
Comment ils sont protégés médicalement,
How are
socialement?
they
Et est-ce
medically
qu'ils payent
protected?
à la société?
And do they pay tax for society when they work in the transition network?
Yes. Yeah, and so the local money, for example, so the local money is not some clever way of not paying tax. It goes through the business like any other money does. So, of course, this is not, transition is not about saying we need to put up a fence around Luxembourg or Totnes and to not let anything go in or out. It's about saying at the moment we are part of a global economy which serves the interests of fewer and fewer people and concentrates wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And we can do a lot better than that. If we have an economy which actually serves the needs of everybody here, it will look very different. But it will still be one where people pay tax for services and for health service and for schools and for those things that we need as a society, but that we make the money locally do a lot more before it leaves and then goes in that direction. Is it okay?
So, over here.
Oh.
I'm Andrea from LUCA, Luxembourg Center for Architecture. Thanks for this very inspiring lecture.
My pleasure.
And thanks for bringing together all this mass of people. I'm very impressed by the mass, by the number of people coming here. So this is proving that our society is finally starting to change. So this is fantastic. But the question I've got, a very big problem we're having in Luxembourg is housing. And we're having this first group ad hoc who is doing something about that, who's trying to get people together to create a cooperative housing form. Do you have any other examples or groups we could refer to that are working on this problem?
Yeah, many. Whether it's through the eco-village movement or what are called community land trusts, as a different model where you hold the land as a community so that the buildings can't be speculated upon and bought and sold, but they're held as affordable housing. For me, I think certainly in England at the moment, there is the most appalling process happening, where the government says we need to build more houses, and we do need more houses. But the building of those houses becomes another way to focus more and more money to fewer and fewer people. We are given a myth which says, when I became a father, the best advice I ever had when I became a father was somebody said to me, out of these 3 things, you can only have 2. You can have happy children, you can have a good relationship with your partner, and you can have a tidy house. But you can't have all 3. So one of those things has to go. I think I chose the right one. So in terms of housing, we're told either we can have beautiful housing, or we can have affordable housing, or we can have low carbon housing. But you can only have one of those things. So affordable housing is always horrible. Low carbon housing is too expensive. And nobody really builds beautiful houses anymore because that's terribly bourgeois and pointless. So we built environments that just people curl up and die in the main, it feels to me. So actually, through the project that I mentioned, the Atmos project in Totnes that we're doing, where as a community we are developing that site, we've done. I was really shocked today in the workshop with architects. They said that in Luxembourg there is no obligation of developers to consult local communities at all. Really, that's incredible. I mean, they do it in England, but it's just a token. They don't really mean it, but at least they make an effort to pretend that they're doing it. For me, actually, if we want to do good development, it has to start with asking the local community. That's the place you start. With the Atmos project now, we have consulted 2,500 local people of what they would like to happen on that site. And when you ask them what they would like to happen on that site, what they come up with, what they want is very different from what the market builds for people. They say we want affordable housing, beautiful housing, using local materials, using natural materials that don't cost us very much to heat, where we get to, that are designed to build conviviality with the people around us, not isolate us all from each other. So actually, as communities, we can do something really remarkable with that. And actually now, there is the government have given communities power in England, which I think they must have been drunk when they wrote it or something. I think they didn't really think it through. It's this thing called a community right to build order. A community right to build order. So, yeah. So what it says is, if you can show that you have consulted local people, and you've designed something based on that consultation, you can apply to have a referendum, you can have a vote, and the people vote on your plan. And if 50% of people vote yes, that's planning permission. It's a new route to planning for community-led development. That's what we're going to be doing on that site. And when you do that, when you ask people, people don't say, please build us little boxes that all look exactly the same. It will be expensive to heat, and I will have to work the rest of my life to pay for. Nobody says that. It's surprising, isn't it? Actually, I think there is a huge potential in reimagining building. So, and the beauty of things like straw bale building, clay straw, earth building, these kind of techniques, everyone can do it. Everyone here could do that. In straw bale building, 50% of the workforce are women. That's fantastic. So actually, we can reimagine house building, I think. But it requires us finding those places where we can get started and begin to model it. And there are places around the world where you can see that. And generally, people who build houses using those materials build just a single house. They're someone's project. But actually, what does it look like if we scale that up for a whole development? And we process those materials on site, and we train young people, and we make beautiful clay plasters, and we build buildings that people love. It would be a revolution. And it could happen, and it is starting to happen. So that, for me, actually, the reimagining housing is going to be one of the key things of the next 5 to 10 years. Housing needs to do a lot more than just be a roof, I think. And also we see, and it has become so toxic and corrupt as well, the sort of the housing development world. And I think as well we can take that part back too.
Good evening, my name is Alain Müller. I could answer my question in English, but my English is not too good.
That's okay.
Not too well. So I say it in French. Ce que vous dites ce soir, ça fait un peu, ça relève un peu de l'utopie, c'est sûr, mais en même temps, l'utopie devient de plus en plus réalité. N'empêche que je crois que derrière ça, il doit y avoir une révolution anthropologique. C'est-à-dire, s'il n'y a pas de changement de mentalité, on peut changer les conditions sociales. Peut-être qu'on n'arrivera pas à de très bons résultats, bien que peut-être c'est dialectique, c'est-à-dire les conditions sociales rétro-agissent. Ah, je vais trop vite, excusez-moi.
So, everything you've been telling us tonight sounds a bit like some sort of a utopia, but what we need is a true revolution in mentality, including, otherwise we won't be able to do anything.
Oui, bon, c'est ce que je voulais dire. Il y a une relation dialectique entre les conditions sociales et la mentalité, peut-être. Donc, est-ce que vous ne pensez pas que, n'empêche qu'il faudrait qu'il y ait d'abord un changement de mentalité avant qu'on puisse vraiment réaliser ce genre d'utopie? Merci.
Don't you think you first need a change of mentality before achieving those changes?
I think if we wait for a change in mentality before we start to do anything, we'll be waiting a very long time. We don't have time. And for me, the best way to change mentality is by creating places of possibility, where people can come and they can see and they can taste and they can talk to and they can engage with a different way of doing things. That's really, really powerful. You know, sometimes people say to me, oh, like you mentioned the word utopia. And people say, oh, this all sounds very utopian. I mean, actually, for me, it's not utopian. For me, it's a compilation of things that I've seen. It's a compilation of the market garden at Terra. It's a combination of the straw bale houses that I've been to see, permaculture gardens I've been to see, agroforestry projects I've been to see. All of those things, they're not some fantasy, they're not something kind of ethereal, they're something very real, they're something very tangible. It's just how do we join them up? How do we accelerate them? And so for me, that was my frustration 10 years ago with permaculture, because permaculture felt like it had the design principles, it had the operating system of a low carbon world. But as a movement, and it's changed a lot since then, but as a movement it was quite happy sort of sitting up a little lane in a wood making chairs out of sticks. And actually for me, so transition was designed to say, how do we accelerate this stuff? How do we make a Trojan horse? You know the Trojan horse? Yeah? Yeah. How do we make a Trojan horse? And you put permaculture inside, and you put Joanna Macy and her amazing work inside. And the thing with permaculture is if someone in a pub says, what's permaculture? You have to get out a flip chart, and you have to draw a picture of chickens and arrows and little greenhouses, and it takes a while. Whereas with transition with a Trojan horse, you just say, oh, it's transition. It's able to move, it kind of can move faster and get into places which permaculture, and they'll get those principles into it. So very often people who work in permaculture and who work in transition they understand permaculture without even maybe having studied it. It sort of, it gets into their DNA somehow.
Hi, thank you for your inspiring talk. It was really great to finally find the right words and terminology for the thoughts I was always having. And I have a very practical question. We are currently researching a bakery cooperation a little bit up north from the town. And we're talking a lot about business plan, counting, and so on, and we doubt about the scale of this project. Should we start really, really small, or should we count how big we actually should be and start big straight away? Could you give some guidance on that?
I think anybody who really took business advice from me might want to go and lie down afterwards. I think there's two ways of doing it. I think part of the question is how big is too big? What's the size? And again, that's the thing I love about the craft beer world, is that actually there is a right size for a brewery, and it's not huge. That actually you get a brewery to a size when it sustains itself and it's profitable, but then you grow it in different ways. You grow it in its adventurousness. You grow it in its experimentation. You grow it in terms of how deep the roots are that it puts down into the local economy. In terms of bakeries, there's a really great model in the UK called the Handmade Bakery, and they were started by a couple. And initially they were just baking in their home, but they had a membership, like Terra do. They had a membership. People became a member, and they paid for a month's bread in advance. So they knew that every other day they would get a loaf of bread, and they paid for it in advance. So it meant that as a bakery, that you knew that you were going to be able to sell the bread for the next month. It made it much easier as a bakery, but actually, not that I'm obsessed with breweries, but then as a bakery, it meant that they then had a membership, and that membership became the people who were out in the town talking about how great you were. And the really clever bit was that when they wanted to expand the business, they wanted to move into a premises, have their own premises, they needed £40,000 to do that. They went to the bank wouldn't lend it to them or wanted too much interest. So they did what they call a bread bond. A bread bond. The way a bread bond works is to say, we need to borrow £40,000, please lend us, they went to all their members, please lend us money, we will pay you 7% interest on that loan, very attractive. Not many places you would get 7% return on an investment these days. But we will pay you the return in bread. So it cost them 2%. So they got to borrow money at 2%, everybody else got a return at 7%, everybody was delighted with the arrangement. So that's a really nice way, but they had built up a kind of, people knew that the bread they made was the best bread they ever had, so that's maybe something that comes second, but it's a really useful strategy for expanding that. So I would say start, get really good at doing what you do, develop a community of people who love what you do, and then go with a bread bond kind of approach. Good luck.
Bonsoir. Je parle en français, excusez-moi. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'un projet est viable si le projet ne produit rien comme argent, comme un projet dans l'éducation? Moi, j'aimerais bien créer une école, mais je pense que ça pourrait être assez facile de créer une communauté. Je pense que ça pourrait être assez facile de créer une communauté et de même avoir des fonds pour démarrer. Mais comment un projet comme ça peut vivre dans le temps, puisque ça ne rapporte pas d'argent? Et j'ai l'impression qu'ici, on a entendu beaucoup d'exemples de projets qui rapportaient, et finalement... Mais est-ce que vous avez connaissance de projets même autres que dans l'éducation, mais qui n'ont pas rapporté d'argent par la suite.
Do you think a transition project can be viable if it cannot generate any profit? We've heard many examples today of projects and associations doing transition, which seems to generate some kind of profit to people working in those communities. I think it's fairly easy to create a community, a group or association, but can we see this group in the long term if it doesn't make any profit? Is it possible?
I think it's possible. The thing that I would question about it is the degree to which it's desirable, because sometimes people say transition, the environmental movement is a white middle class movement, and actually for me one of the things with that is that if you have a movement which entirely depends on volunteers, there is a kind of a tyranny of volunteering, I think. If you run a project and you think we're really, really inclusive because we're not paying anybody any money, actually you exclude as many people as you include. I was in America 2 years ago, the only time I went on an airplane in the last 8 years, and I met a woman from Richmond in California who does an amazing project called Urban Tilth, working in a mostly black community, Richmond in California, doing urban food growing in the shadow of a huge Chevron oil refinery that exploded and covered the whole place in soot. And she said, and we were doing a talk together, and I said that actually there is a kind of a tyranny to volunteerism because we imagine that everybody can do it and lots of people can't. And she said, it's so refreshing to hear somebody say that, because actually in my community, if this is a revolution that depends on volunteers, I can't be part of this revolution. I have to spend 6 days a week working just to keep a roof over my head. I don't have time to volunteer on things like this. So I think projects that don't generate a profit have a role, and they can do really fantastic things. But I think for me the question is how do we do this in such a way that we can be generating livelihoods for people? And actually, there are often ways that we can look at doing those projects in a slightly different way where we can do that. And I think quite often in the kind of green movement, we have a sense that if you bring money in and people are paid to do something, that somehow it pollutes it and it somehow loses its kind of moral integrity somehow. But for me, I think it's really important that we start to look at how do we create new livelihoods out of doing this stuff. That's not to say that actually, that's not also to say that most transition groups are run by volunteers, and volunteers are hugely important, and can do incredible things. But I think as we move forward, one of the things we need to be trying to do is to create ways that we can create jobs for people.
In what you told us, and in many stories I have already heard about transition groups that start and begin to their activities, the focus is often on the start and what it brings people together and what they do for the first things. Could you tell us, in your experience, about the oldest transition groups like Totnes or Bristol, how they evolve in time and how they stay alive, and if they're at a point where they create a critical mass and spread out in a wider community or in the city or to people that are not closely related to the first group, to the first active group, or if they bring new traditions or new culture in their city, in their place.
Thank you, that's a very good question. Well, I think Totnes is the place that I know the best. It's the place I can talk about the most. I wouldn't want to give the impression that everybody in Totnes loves transition and is doing transition very busily. I think the survey that we did a while ago, we found that 3/4 of people had heard of it. About 65% of people thought it was a good thing, they were generally supportive of it. About 1/3 of people had had some kind of engagement with it. And then maybe 2 or 3% were very active in making it happen. Which, about 30% had been to something, and maybe 2 or 3% were very active. So, but actually, it starts to become part of the story that the place tells about itself. There was a story of a woman whose daughter went to Canada and was in one of the Great Lakes in a canoe. And she was paddling along and she saw another boat and she thought, well, I better be sociable. So she paddled over and said hello, and the woman said, oh, where are you from? She said, I'm from Totnes. She said, transition town Totnes. And sometimes it can be, we get lots of people who come to Totnes to see. And actually, when you look, you might not see much difference. One time we had a very angry German man came into our office. He said, I have come all the way from Germany to see the famous transition town Totnes. And you still have cars. Well, I mean, you might want to be a bit realistic about your expectations. So we do tours and take people around and show them the different things. I think in cars, no, probably walking. I think actually the Atmos project that I mentioned has been really, really interesting in terms of bringing many different sectors of the community together. Maybe in the first time that we have. The fact that in our consultation we made a space to invite people to tell their stories about the history of that factory meant that a whole load of people who worked in that factory for 20, 30, 40 years came in to tell their stories and felt part of what was happening there. I think it's our town council voted themselves a transition town council. It's something which is in the story of the place, the story that the place tells about itself. And many of the different organisations working together, I think that's something that is happening more and more. We have a very interesting thing happening now, where as the town is surrounded by more and more applications for really dreadful housing developments, and we have things like Atmos happening that are good developments, we start to see a kind of a community coming together to say we don't want any more of this bad development, we want good development. So there is an expression sometimes used, I don't know if you have it here, about being in NIMBY. Do you know this expression, being in NIMBY? So it means not in my backyard. So people sometimes criticize people who object to development as being NIMBYs. You don't want anything, nothing in my backyard. We say, actually, we are a town of swimbies. We want something wonderful in our backyard. Why should we have to have this rubbish when we could do so much better? And that's been a really interesting kind of unifying idea, bringing lots of different groups together.
We will go for a last question. And before we go that, I invite you after that question and the response of it to our dinner that is set up by you. And if you have not done so, please leave your address, we can stay in touch. And the donations boxes are still around. There are books about all these stories that you can get over there. And there are also some DVDs I can really recommend, In Transition 2.0, which is 1 hour and it's really very enjoyable. And Rob's last book is also something you can really read in a hammock, so I can really recommend it. So now for the last question.
You can read it in other places too, if you want to.
So many people. So you can still ask questions afterwards, but not through the microphone. We will go on with this discussion.
I'm here, I'm not running away afterwards if you want to ask me something.
Hello, good evening. My name is Christian. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk, and I've learned a lot. But one thing you talked about was a little bit to shortcome, for me, it's about the interchange. You said you can prepare an environment to give an interchange a chance, yeah. But I think this question about the interchange is the question if this ship will sail or sink. How do you think it would be best, or how would you describe this kind of interchange in detail? For example, yes, you said supervisions and stuff, soluting conflicts in groups and so on, because transition is living off its groups. And I would like to know how you imagine this. And as another rhetorical question is, with which the whole stuff sinks or sails is, for example, do you all here in this room love me unconditionally, yes or no? It's very easy, this question, and I'd like to give it to you.
Thank you. I think for me, I'm not the right person to ask. Sophie Banks, who I'm sure would be coming, who's developed the whole inner transition field, is very much something she's really brilliant on. I think for me, it's really about one of the key elements of transition is how we create a healthy human culture. And actually, we tend to just value the things that we do. In our lives, our careers, value the things that we do, not us. When we go to work, we take our head to work and we leave the rest of us behind. And actually, what we try and do in Transition Network is to value the being and the doing equally. So when we meet as a group, we meet one month, we do stuff about doing, we meet the next month, we do stuff about being, which is really about looking at how we support each other, so people can bring all of themselves to doing this work. I think as well, it's kind of a bit like a sort of political question, what's transition's relation to politics in terms of, for me, it's about looking at what we have in common rather than what we have kind of separate from each other. So actually, transition is something which is determinedly non-party political. So it's also determinedly non-kind of aligned to any kind of spiritual tradition or religious tradition, because that's something that sort of tends to sort of drive people apart, really. So for me, the inner transition is kind of a process about how it supports this work, so we're as able and as supported to give our best to doing this process. I think it's time for a break. Thank you very much.